All right, so welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works. You send us the sources, we pull out the good stuff, make sure you're in the know without, like, drowning in information.
Yeah, we're all about respecting your time.
Exactly. And this one's special, especially if you're, a learner at heart. We're going way back.
7th century CE.
Right, the world right before the arrival of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And to get us there, we've got some excerpts from a YouTube video by Furqan Qureshi blogs.
Really fascinating stuff.
Because think about it, this source makes this wild claim that in just 25 years, the Arabs, they went from, like the source says, the poorest, most backward and divided.
To a major global force.
25 years. It's mind-boggling.
It really is.
So that's what we're digging into. What was going on back then? What was the world like that made such a huge shift even possible?
And the source keeps coming back to this idea that to even start to get it, we need to understand the Seerah.
The Seerah, right. Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar, the source explains, can mean a few things actually. Method, attitude, way of walking.
It's about someone's whole path in life.
Exactly. But when we talk about Seerat Un Nabi, we're talking specifically about the Prophet Muhammad's life, peace be upon him. All 63 years, his biography, the whole story.
And the source lays out two, I guess you could call them like big reasons why this matters.
Oh yeah, hit us with those.
So firstly, for Muslims, it's like the ultimate manual, the Quran. Like in Surah Al-Asab, it's saying, look, the Prophet's life, this is the best example for anyone who wants to get close to Allah, for anyone who wants to understand the last day.
It's not just a bunch of stories, right? It's showing you how to live.
Exactly. And the source even points out that there are all these verses all over the Quran, Surah Al-Imran, Al-Ma'idah, Al-Anfal, and more, and they all have this same command, obey Allah and his messenger.
Right, right.
And then it gets to this powerful link. It says, whoever obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah.
So it's deeper than just following rules.
Much deeper. And what that means, the source says, is if you really want to understand Islam, like really practice it the way it's meant to be, based on the Quran, then reading the Seerah, it becomes, the source uses the strong word obligatory. Like you need to at least read it once.
Because it's putting those teachings into action.
It's the living example of the Quran in action.
Got it, got it. And then the source talks about why it matters, even if you're, not Muslim.
Yeah, it's saying the Seerah is like this key to unlock that incredible transformation we talked about, how the Arabs went from, where they were to shaping the world.
Right, like what made that happen?
It's the missing piece of the puzzle, historically speaking.
And here's where it gets really cool. The source talks about how the Seerah actually changed, like how history was written.
Oh, yeah, this is fascinating. They're saying because Muslims wanted to get the Prophet's life down accurately, it led to this whole revolution in how you record history, the methodology.
Okay, so what did they do?
Well, they created whole new fields of study, like Yuzul al-Hadith. Think of it like a really rigorous set of rules for figuring out if a historical account is actually reliable, like a science of hadith,
Fact-checking on another level.
Exactly. And then there's Azama al-Lihal, which is all about like really deep biographical analysis of the people who are telling these stories, the narrators. Are they trustworthy?
So it's not just what happened, but who said it happened.
Right. And the source says this level of scrutiny, it was unheard of before.
So the Seerah, it's not just a story. It's this, like, historical turning point in how we even think about the past.
And the source even goes as far as saying studying the Seerah, it's almost like the foundation for understanding all knowledge, like the shore of this vast ocean.
Wow. Okay, so big picture stuff. But to really get it, to get the context of this whole moment, we got to rewind, right?
Back to the 7th century.
7th century CE. What's the world looking like?
Well, according to the source, you've got these two big empires dominating things, the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire.
Okay, two powerhouses, and then there's
India.
Yeah.
Ancient civilization, tons of history and tradition.
But not quite an empire in the same way, right?
Right.
So let's start with Persia. The source talks about their, like, intense pride in their ancient history. There's this story about King Darius sending a ball, some gold, and a whip to Alexander the Great.
Oh, I've heard that one. It's like a power move,
Totally. But by the 7th century, things aren't so glorious anymore.
No. The source paints this picture of moral decline. Their religions, like Zoroastrianism and Ain Mani, they were supposed to be divinely inspired, right? But the source says they'd become corrupted. And that led to this breakdown of basic moral values.
Oh, wow. Are there, like, specific examples of that?
Yeah, the source talks about this philosopher Mazdak and his pretty controversial views on women. Like, he basically saw them as almost communal property.
Yes.
And there's this story about a court ruling attributed to Mazdak that really shows how messed up things were. So socially, it was pretty bad.
And politically.
Well, the kings, they still had power. They were seen as appointed by God,
Mhm.
but things were unstable. Lots of leadership changes, not a lot of peace.
Gotcha. Okay, and then there's the Roman Empire, which by this time has split, right?
Right, into the Western Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And it's the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern one, that ends up interacting with the early Muslims later on.
They even mention Emperor Heraclius, right?
Yes, exactly.
So what's going on in the Roman Empire during this time?
Well, one of the big things the source highlights is slavery. It was everywhere. People were sold into slavery to pay off debts. Parents were even selling their own children and vice versa.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, really grim stuff. And religiously, Christianity had, well, let's just say it had evolved a lot since its early days. Well, the source claims there was something like 45,000 different Christian denominations.
Wow, 45,000. Really?
I know, it sounds wild. And the Byzantine Empire might not have had all 45,000, but the idea of one God, which is like, fundamental to the original message, that had, according to the source, been replaced with this doctrine of the Trinity.
Okay, so a lot of theological differences popping up.
Yeah, lots of divisions. And then there's the Pope. He'd become hugely powerful. In some cases, the source says, even more powerful than the actual rulers. Like, he could make or break governments.
So there's this tension between spiritual and political power going on.
Exactly.
Okay, and then there's India, which, like you said, is old, right? Tons of history. The source even talks about Alexander the Great going there and his scholars being, like, super fascinated by all the elephants and monkeys.
They had all these accounts of exotic plants and animals, totally different customs.
Sounds like a whole other world.
Yeah.
And it mentions empires like Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka.
Yeah, powerful empires. But by the 7th century, things had shifted.
Not so powerful anymore.
No. The empires were fading, and the teachings of figures like Buddha, they weren't as influential anymore. The source says polytheism had become like the dominant thing. People were worshiping all kinds of idols. There are these accounts from Chinese travelers at the time talking about seeing countless idols everywhere.
Polytheism, idols. So not exactly a unified belief system.
No, not at all. And there were all these social problems too. The Brahmin class, they had all the power. And there were these practices like sati.
Oh, right, where widows would throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre.
Yeah, really tragic stuff. But even with all that going on, there's this thread of hope, the source mentions. People were like waiting for a Messiah figure. There's even a verse from the Gita about it.
So even in the midst of like all this darkness, there's still this longing for something better.
Absolutely. And it kind of ties into this broader theme of unease, this feeling across the world that things just weren't right.
Got it. And just to round out the picture, the source mentions North and South America being undiscovered, at least officially, from the perspective of known world at the time. And Africa is depicted as this mostly unknown land.
Lots of forests and deserts, tribal wars. The source even mentions cannibal tribes.
Whoa, okay, so basically a lot of the world was still this mystery.
And the parts they did know, well, those empires were facing some serious internal struggles and moral decay.
Setting the stage for what happens next.
Exactly.
Right. So before we get to Arabia, let's talk about Bani Israel, the children of Israel, because they play a pretty important role in this whole story too.
They do. And the source, it acknowledges their history, the blessings they received. But it also suggests they'd become, well, kind of arrogant. They had the sense of being like the only ones truly favored by Allah.
Oh, okay. I see where this is going.
And the source connects that attitude to their love of wealth and money, their practice of usury.
Usury, so like lending money with really high interest rates.
Right. And it's saying that led to this hardening of hearts, people doing immoral things.
So they kind of strayed from their spiritual roots.
Yeah, and as a result, their position in the world, it had weakened. They didn't have their own country. They didn't control Jerusalem. The source actually calls them a distorted nation, religiously, politically, and morally.
Wow. Okay, so kind of a world in decline, even among people who have this rich religious heritage.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak picture.
All right, so finally, let's zoom in on the Arabian Peninsula, the place where it all begins.
Right. And it's worth mentioning that Saudi Arabia, that's a modern name. It wasn't called that back then.
Hmm.
In the Prophet's time, it was divided into different regions: Hijaz, Najd, Najran, Yathrib, which we now know as Medina.
Right, right.
And geographically, it was, well, mostly desert. Dry, sandy, rocky, mountainous. Not a lot of vegetation except near the coasts and some oases. Dates were like the main thing they grew.
Not exactly paradise.
No, not exactly. But the source kind of hints that these harsh conditions, they might be part of the reason why this place was chosen for the last prophet.
Hmm. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So the source goes on to talk about the people of Arabia, and it breaks them down into three groups. The first one is the Arabs of the past.
The Arabs of the past. So who are we talking about here?
Ancient tribes that, well, they basically disappeared. Ad, Kamud, the Amalekites, Jadliz. The source mentions archaeological sites like Madain Saleh, which are these amazing palaces built by Thamud. There's even mention of the people of Iram, which is like this legendary lost city mentioned in the Quran.
So these are like the ancient civilizations that came before.
Exactly. And then you've got the second group, the Arabs of Arba, also known as the Katani Arabs. These were the people who were already living in the peninsula when Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him, arrived with his family.
Right, right. But the Prophet Muhammad, he's not from that line, is he?
No, he's not. Which brings us to the third group, the Arabs of Mustaruba.
Rarebai is Arabs.
Exactly. They're the descendants of Prophet Abraham through his son, Ishmael.
Okay, so let's talk about that lineage. Where does it all begin?
Well, the source starts by mentioning Noah's flood and how his sons spread out across the world. One of them, Shem, settled in the Arabian Peninsula, and over time, all these different tribes emerged, including the Banu Jurhum.
Setting the scene for Abraham and his family.
Exactly. So Abraham arrives in Mecca with Hajar and their son Ishmael.
Right, and the Kaaba, at that time, it was just a raised foundation, right? It wasn't the structure we know today.
Yeah, it was later built by Abraham and Ishmael, but the source focuses more on the story of Hajar and Ishmael being left in the desert and how Hajar desperately searched for water for her son.
And that's how the Zamzam spring came to be, right?
Right, through a miracle. And there are different narrations about how exactly it happened. Some say it was Ishmael striking the ground, others say it was Angel Gabriel.
Wow, okay, I'd never heard that.
And then the Banu Jurhum tribe, they settled nearby. Now this is important because Abraham, Hajar, and Ishmael, they didn't speak Arabic. It was through interacting with the Banu Jurhum that Ishmael learned the language.
Oh, so that's how Arabic came into the family line.
Exactly. And he eventually married a woman from the tribe, and that union is the direct link to Prophet Muhammad.
So Ishmael has 12 sons, right? And their families, they start to spread out.
Yes, but one of them, Adnan, he stays near Mecca, and the source actually mentions a statement from Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, that the Prophet's lineage is well documented all the way back to Adnan.
So solid historical records.
Yes, and the Prophet himself would only trace his lineage back to Adnan.
Interesting. So Adnan's descendants, they become all these different tribes.
Right, and one of them is Nadar. He's given the title Quresh, which means gathering, because he brought his brothers together in Mecca. And then you have Ad-Manaf, who has several sons, including Mutalib and Hashim, who are key figures in the Prophet's family history.
So the Quraysh, they basically become the tribe in Mecca, right?
Yeah, even though many other descendants of Adnan moved away, the Quraysh stayed put. There was some infighting at first, but then this guy, Qasay ibn Kilab, he unifies them and really establishes their dominance.
And later on, the Prophet's opponents will actually try to use Qasay's name against him.
Yeah, they'll try to say, hey, you're not a real Quraysh. Qasay wouldn't have accepted you.
Interesting tactic. But anyway, so Qasay, he brings the Quraysh together.
Yeah.
And then what?
Well, he takes on all these important roles. He oversees the rebuilding of the Kaaba. He sets up Darun Nadwa, which is this meeting place where they make big decisions, including like how to feed all the pilgrims coming to Mecca. He's the flag bearer. He holds the keys to the Kaaba.
So he's basically running the show.
He is. And later, all those responsibilities, they get passed down to Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's grandfather.
Ah, okay. So that's where he comes in.
Exactly. But to understand Abdul Muttalib, we have to go back to his father, Hashim, and his uncle, Muttalib. Hashim, his name actually means one who breaks bread. It's fitting.
He was super generous, famous for feeding the pilgrims who came to Mecca. He married this woman in Medina, Salma bint Amr, but then he dies while traveling in Syria. And his son, Sheba, is born after his death with white hair.
Sheba, meaning white hair.
Exactly. So Muttalib, he goes to Medina to find his nephew, and it's this whole emotional reunion. He brings Sheba back to Mecca, and people are like, who's this kid? At first, some think he's Muttalib's slave, which is why he's called Abdul Muttalib.
Abdul, meaning slave of.
Right. But later, everyone realizes, no, he's actually the son of Hashim, Muttalib's brother. And so this Abdul Muttalib, he becomes the prophet's grandfather.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from Noah's flood to the prophet's grandfather. What a journey.
Right. And all this, it's setting the stage for the arrival of the final prophet.
Okay, so big question here. Why Arabia? Of all the places in the world, why was this seemingly insignificant desert peninsula chosen for such a momentous event?
Well, the source gives a few reasons. First, unlike those big empires we talked about, Arabia was never conquered by anyone. So never really part of, like, the mainstream world.
Nope. And a big part of that was, well, it didn't have a lot of resources. No fertile land, no big rivers, not exactly a tempting target for invaders.
Kind of a blessing in disguise, maybe?
Right, because here's the thing. Because they were so isolated, the Arabic language stayed pure. It didn't get mixed with other languages like in those big empires.
So their language, their culture, it was preserved.
Exactly. And while all those empires were struggling with, like the source says, distorted education, civilization, and morals, Arabia, well, it had its own problems for sure.
Which we'll get to, I'm sure.
Right. But they weren't corrupted in the same way.
So they still had some good qualities left.
Yeah, like the source talks about their love of freedom, their courage, their honesty. They had this respect for truth-telling, which the source says might have made them more open to a new message.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's the location. Arabia, it was right in the middle of everything. It connected Africa, India, Persia, even Europe through the Roman Empire.
So strategically placed to spread a message far and wide.
Exactly. It was like the perfect starting point for a new era.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this world in decline, and then we've got Arabia, this isolated place with a preserved language, a unique history, and a key location.
Right. It's all coming together.
And then, boom, the prophet arrives.
And everything changes.
But before we go there, the source does touch on the state of affairs within Arabia at the time. And let's just say it wasn't pretty.
Yeah, there was a lot of, let's call it barbarity going on.
Right, which kind of makes this whole transformation even more amazing.
It's like a complete 180, and the source calls it a miracle brought about by the Seerah.
And just to be clear, the Seerah, that covers the prophet's whole life, right? But the big changes we're talking about, those happen in a much shorter time frame.
Yeah, it's about 25 years from when he starts receiving revelation to his passing.
25 years. It's incredible.
It really is.
So to sum up, what we've learned today is that the world in the 7th century, it was a mess. Empires are crumbling, morals were decaying, and in the middle of all that, you have Arabia. This seemingly insignificant peninsula that, because of its isolation, had actually held on to some really important qualities.
A pure language, a strong culture, and this inherent potential for change.
And that, my friend, is the world into which Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, arrived.
A world ripe for transformation.
And that's a story for another deep dive. But until then, I want you to think about this. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the most unexpected places.
It makes you wonder, what are those hidden strengths, even in our own times, that could lead to something truly amazing?
Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.